Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the much-anticipated celebration of the Lauinger Library's 40th anniversary, as well as the launch of the final volume of Emmett Curran's A History of Georgetown, published by the Georgetown University Press. My name is Artemis Kirk, University Librarian, and it's a pleasure to have you join us in marking 4 decades of service to Georgetown University. Simultaneously and sadly, the event also memorializes the library's namesake, Joseph Mark Lauinger, class of 1967, whose life ended 40 years ago in service to the United States during the Vietnam War. In respect to his memory, I'm going to call for a moment of silence. Thank you. Today's event could not have been possible without the contributions of many people. Thanks to Richard Brown, Gina Lindquist, and Jackie Bielhart of the Georgetown Press, Ann Galloway and Lynn Conway of the Special Collections Research Center, Julie Bataille, Colleen Litkenhouse, and Dan McNeil of the Office of Communications, David Hagan, Jessica Pierce, and Tess Winkler of the Lauinger Library staff, and the members of the 40th Anniversary Committee of the Georgetown University Library Board, Lucy Lewis, Phil Lauinger, Kathy Pomerank, and Catherine Richardson. One of the library's most important supporters is the person I now have the privilege to introduce, Georgetown's president, John J. DeGioia. President DeGioia graduated from the university in 1979 and has since served as both senior administrator and faculty member. He has been president of Georgetown since 2001, and through his vision, collaborations, and innovations, continues to define and strengthen Georgetown University as a premier institution for education and research. President DeGioia also wrote the foreword for A History of Georgetown, and I'm delighted to invite him to speak to us. Please join me in welcoming President DeGioia.
Thank you very much, Artemis. Thank you for your leadership and your continued dedication and commitment to this library and to all that you do as a leader of our university. It's great to be with you today and to be able to celebrate. And for all of you, this is an opportunity for appreciation, gratitude, and an opportunity to welcome you all back for a very special moment in the life of this university community. We're honored to be joined by so many extraordinary members of our university community for this celebration. And I'd like to thank the members of the Georgetown University Library Board for your leadership and support. It's great to welcome back our Emmett Curran. Emmett, it's great to have you with us as the author of A History of Georgetown University, Professor Emeritus at Georgetown, and I know for many, as I look around the room, somebody you all have known Emmett for many, many years. I also like to welcome Richard Brown, the director of Georgetown University Press. And thank you for your ongoing leadership and stewarding this project through and to the celebration today. I'd also like to acknowledge the members of the Lauinger family who are able to be with us today. George and Kathleen and Frank, Jennifer and Phil, Tony. It is great to have this opportunity to be with all of you, that we're able to celebrate this 40th anniversary of the Joseph Mark Lauinger Memorial Library as a testament to your family's support for Georgetown that has extended well over a century. This is a 4-generation family for Georgetown University, and it began with Frank Lauinger, Georgetown University Law Center in 1895. So we remain very indebted to your family's ongoing contribution, your ongoing connection to the Hilltop, and it's an honor to be able to be with you all today and to be able to celebrate with all of you today. In addition, as Artemis mentioned, to celebrating Lauinger and its ongoing legacy, we're also fortunate to be able to mark the release of Emmett Curran's A History of Georgetown University. And the book is an exhaustive study of Georgetown's rise from a small college, the Potomac, to our position today as a truly global university. Emmett, we are deeply grateful to you for your commitment to this institution. Very excited to share your new volumes with our community. And I suppose the setting for this moment is very poignant as I think about Father Durkin and his spirit being present with us as you take the history of Georgetown to this next level. At the heart of the academy, and indeed at the center of the Jesuit educational mission, is our library. And as John Glavin will discuss later in his lecture, the libraries on our hilltop have allowed Georgetown to grow from a small academy to a global research university. They've always formed an invaluable piece of our identity, and I'm looking forward, John, to your reflections. They're always very special. Since Lauinger opened in 1970, the ways in which our faculty and students create and transfer knowledge have changed dramatically. The use of digital research, video, and audio have all shaped the way that our faculty and students do their work. And Jim O'Donnell, our provost, will discuss the libraries at Georgetown and how they continue to adapt to this change in scholarship and research brought about by technological advancement as we've been coping with this over the course of these now 40 years. And Lauinger has always served as a gathering place for our students, providing them a place to explore new knowledge with each other. Within the Hilltop community, the newly expanded Midnight Mug provides a social hub for students in the library. It would have been inconceivable during my undergraduate years that we would have had Joe, to have Joe Jeffs and Sue Martin here. I know you're both wondering whatever happened to, but that the newly expanded Midnight Mug provides a social hub for our students in the library. And as you may know, Club Lau has proved an incredible success with this generation of students, bringing the community to Lauinger in a slightly different context and atmosphere than might have been expected in years past. And for me to be in this room, I spent quite a few late nights in this room, as I can imagine many of you all did, and I'm not sure, there's always in my life here in the university community, there's always a moment or two that are very special because of the significance of being in a particular place and what it has meant in terms of my own formation. For now more than a couple generations of students, this room has been a place where they may have done some of the most important intellectual work in their lives. And so to have that opportunity to be here and to be able to introduce this event today and to be able to celebrate in this space with the Lauinger family and with all of you is very, very special. Under Artemis's leadership, the presence and impact of Lauinger on our campus and in our wider community has continued to grow with programs like the Library Associates and the myriad of public workshops and lectures that are offered. This is an exciting and dynamic time for university libraries and a special moment for us to be celebrating the 40th year of Lauinger. And we look forward to building on the success of the previous 4 decades as we continue to develop and sustain our programming and our resources. It is a privilege for me to be with you this evening and to welcome you back to the Hilltop and to thank you so much for your continued support of Georgetown as we mark this very special occasion in the life of our community. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Jack. This anniversary is an opportunity for me to say that Georgetown University takes the library for granted, and I hope you always will. You may take for granted that Lauinger Library will continue to provide and preserve extraordinary collections in all formats for our users and for posterity. You may take for granted that we will continue to recruit an extraordinary staff of experts representing diverse populations for the teaching, learning, and research needs of our communities. And you may take for granted that we will continue to respect the values of Georgetown's Jesuit and Catholic heritage in support of a distinctive education. I, however, do not take you for granted, so I want to acknowledge again and to thank people who are here today for their contributions to the library's successes over these 4 decades. I'm going to ask some of these folks to stand, but if you are inclined to applaud, please hold your applause until the end. First and foremost, the excellent and dedicated staff of Lauinger Library, whose service ethos is unparalleled. Would those of you who are here please stand? Oh, come on. Thank you. The rest are minding the store. Thank you. Next, my predecessor university librarians, Joseph Jeffs and Susan K. Martin. Joe built this library and celebrated its opening with some of you in 1970. Members of the Faculty Library Advisory Committee, or the FLAC, who support us with their feedback and, yes, even their flack. Anybody here? Thank you. The library master planning team, including architects, library and facilities staff, who helped us imagine what a library of the future might look like. The Georgetown Chimes, whose contributions to their named endowment enables the library to grow. Members of the Chimes. The Georgetown Library Board for their contributions of time, talent, and treasure. Folks? And of course, the Lauinger family, many of whom are here: Frank, Kathleen, and George Lauinger, Phil Lauinger, Tony and Phyllis Lauinger, Anne Lauinger-Fechtel, and Jennifer Lauinger-Lofgren. Stand. Thank you all. And thank you to the Georgetown Library Associates, whose support provides great programs like today's. I'm now pleased to introduce Richard Brown, Director of Georgetown University Press. Prior to arriving at Georgetown in 2001, he spent 9 years in religion publishing, first as an editor at Pilgrim Press, and then as director of Westminster John Knox Press. Richard holds a PhD in religious studies from the University of Virginia, where he wrote a dissertation on human rights. He is also the current president of the American Association of University Presses. Please welcome Richard Brown, who will introduce our first two speakers. Richard.
Thank you, Artemis, and welcome everyone. Artemis, on behalf of everyone at Georgetown University Press, happy anniversary. It would be impossible to overstate the significance of this event in what has become, over the years, a vital and fruitful relationship between Lauinger Library and Georgetown University Press. This celebration reflects not only an important symbolic, but also a very practical collaboration between two communities of learning at this institution. Artemis, you and the members of your staff, including John Bushman, John Buchtel, Lynn Conway, Ann Galloway, Dave Hagan, Joan Chevery, among many others, have demonstrated through the various collaborations we've had an astonishing degree of collegiality and goodwill, not to mention resourcefulness and commitment. We will always be grateful for that. Libraries and scholarly publishers ought to be thick as thieves, shoulder to shoulder, given the common interest we share in disseminating and preserving the best scholarship, scholarship that ultimately serves society and our common good. There ought to be a sense of community, a sense of solidarity. Sadly, that doesn't happen at every institution, but it does happen here. At Georgetown, and I say this without qualification, that without the remarkable efforts of Lauinger Library, this glorious 3-volume history of this university, for all of Emmett's brilliance, simply could not have happened. And all of us here this afternoon would have been deprived of a definitive story of this institution, an institution that 219 years since its founding stands for so much of what is right and what is good in the academy and in society. I'll return to Emmett Curran in a moment, but it's now my happy charge to introduce Professor John Glavin, who has been such an important part of the recent history of this university and who continues today to be a profound and inspiring presence among us. John came to Georgetown 50 years ago as a freshman in the college class of 1964. He returned to the Hilltop in 1967 and has been a member of the Department of English for the past 43 years. In 1997, he co-founded the Carroll Fellows Initiative, the university's flagship program for its most academically talented undergraduates, and since 2003, he has also served as the University Fellowship Secretary. His academic interests center on issues of adaptation from the stage to the page, and from the page to the large and the small screen. He is the author, most recently, of After Dickens, Reading, Adaptation, and Performance, as well as Dickens on Screen, both published by Cambridge University Press, which I'm told is a fairly respectable publisher. He's currently working on a collection of farces by and adapted from Dickens. John will speak to us this afternoon on this topic, Lauinger as a built space. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce John Glavin.
Thanks. Thank you, Richard. I'm here under false pretenses. The president told you that I was going to talk about the history of Georgetown's libraries, and I'm not. I usually do talk about historical matters when I give talks like this, but I realized that in looking at this distinguished real historian, Emmett Curran, I couldn't possibly claim to say anything about history without shaming myself. And I also had some other things that I wanted to say about this library that are very personal to me and that I don't think I could ever say elsewhere with such an attentive audience. And so I'm not speaking on what I've just been told I was speaking on. I'm giving some remarks which I'm calling "This Thing of Darkness I Acknowledge Mine." Some of you will recognize that as a moment at the end of The Tempest, where Prospero is forced to admit that the monster Caliban is in some way his. And I want to call this talk, "This Thing of Darkness I Acknowledge Mine," because this thing of darkness, Lauinger Library, I acknowledge mine. It's my monster. But unlike Prospero, I'm happy to say I love my monster. I love Lauinger. And I mean by that not Artemis and her fabulous staff or the library as a vital campus institution, both of which I do love, but I love the building. I love the building and all its eccentric and architectural monstrosity. And I am here to tell you why. There are two different big opinions of Lauinger as a building. One, the sort of architectural consensus is that it's the most distinguished building built by the university on the main campus in the second half of the 20th century, which, given all the things that Georgetown built in the second half of the 20th century, isn't much of a claim. This is a family event. The other consensus, the sort of broad campus consensus, what people outside are saying, is that it's a blot, a brutalist blot. As one of the deans said to me, and to think that in that space there were once tennis courts. But actually, I think there's a third way. A while back, I was visited on campus by a former student and his wife, and she had never seen the campus before, but she knew about Lauinger. And as we walked around, she said something about its history from her family's point of view. She said it had actually been designed by her uncle, who had worked in the very large Warnecke atelier. At one point, John Carl Warnecke's architectural practice was the largest in the country. And that he had been the designer of this building. And after designing this building, he had left her aunt and left a very unhappy marriage and stopped leading a very secret life and went to bat, as they say, for the other side. And suddenly, Lauinger made for me a new and very powerful sense. I realized that in Lauinger we have what we can call the architecture of the closet. You know, think about the radical disjunction between the inner and the outer, the way it insistently walls itself off and in, hiding its core, refusing to be seen, or red, gray, brooding, crouched down in its sight, a model of and a monument to a hidden life. But I have to say, as I looked into these family stories, I discovered that it was only half true. It's true about the uncle, but that is his personal life, but it's not true about his professional life. That is, he was really a very young architect and really was not the principal designer of the building. Nevertheless, whatever the cause, once you see Lauinger as a closet, Hard to see it any other way. At least that's what I found, in part because it's so full of closets. I don't mean broom closets and coat closets. I mean the 175 closets that we call in the language of the Academy carrels. These little private studies that ring the building's perimeter on the second and the fourth and the fifth floors. In fact, Lauinger isn't really a closet, it's a kind of mall of closets. And what people don't like about its brutalist facades derives precisely from all these closet carrels that close it off and in. They are what makes everyone from the outside dislike it so much. Stacks are stacks, every library has them, they all look the same. It's these ranks of carrels, closets, carrels, that set Lauinger apart. The closets make Lauinger itself, which is why I love it, because those closets make Lauinger, for a scholar, a magical place to work. Now, I realize that most of you have not even been inside one of these closets, let alone written anything in them, so I have to explain some of this, and I want to begin with some definitions of closet from the Oxford English Dictionary, courtesy of Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, whose book, The Epistemology of the Closet, remains the iconic text. A closet is basically defined as a room for privacy or retirement. We get that as early as 1586. We do call that most secret place in the house, appropriate unto our own private studies, a closet. And you will remember in Hamlet that when Hamlet is called to see the queen after the mousetrap, he's called to the queen's closet, her really private rooms, room in which he murders Polonius. But it is also a place for private devotion, a place for secluded speculation, a repository of valuables. And in a definition I find really evocative, a closet is a small space that communicates to a larger. And I'll come back to that. So a closet's the absolute antithesis to an office. Right, an office is open to the public, it has multiple uses. A closet has only one purpose, thinking. In the closet, you see no one. Until cell phones, you didn't have to hear from anybody. Classically, the closet is or was a place into which you withdrew when you wanted to do your most serious thinking, the kind of thinking we call in the university scholarship. Virginia Woolf famously insisted that all writers need a room of one's own. But she was talking about those who write fiction. And scholarship, I think, flourishes in a room no one owns, because scholarship reflects not the searcher, but the search. Even on campuses, we now live in a world of nonstop noise, which the world calls information. A world that suspects privacy and stigmatizes solitude as antisocial. A world that demands, as the great architectural critic Robert Harbison argues, that we agree to relish the notion that everyone is thinking the same thing, producing not community, but a very different and very dangerous thing, the illusion of community. And it is against that illusion and that sameness that the closet struggles, because it knows what those who live the life of the mind have always known, that a thoughtful self is possible only in a small space. I know this because for a very happy year, I wrote a book in one of those Lauinger closets, a book which could not have been written in a space of any different form. Day by day, Lauinger permitted me to live more and more continuously within my subject, leaving the world of distractions and occasions to find, waiting for me when I pulled back the chair and turned on the light, the emerging argument, concentrated, available, saying, welcome back, I'm ready to resume. And this happened because of the shape of the space. We don't need feng shui to recognize that thought gets shaped by the space from which it originates. In the Lauinger carrel, there is a window, but it is to the side. And when you are seated, it is behind your shoulder, baffling the outside eye. Light comes in through the window, which is airtight, but the light moves, pulsed by the trees outside or the reflections off the river, which means you know the world is out there, but you also know it will make no demands while you work. And though austere, the space never makes you feel imprisoned or oppressed. It has been pared down merely to the necessities, but all the necessities are there. The desktop, the filing cabinet, a few shelves also behind you for books. It is utterly still. It is disciplined without being rigid, agreeable without being distracting. It creates and it sustains concentration. Indeed, after weeks of working in this space that so insistently refuses the cozy, the chummy, the comfortable, you begin to wonder, what did we ever see in the cozy, the chummy, the comfortable? And then you remember that these things do have a place, and this place is called home. And that's where they should stay. Why? Because the pages we write in such closets, even when we write on most worldly subjects, are, in Harbison's wonderful phrase, cages of imagined mirrors. Really lovely phrase, cages of imagined mirrors. Because thinking, we don't look directly at the real. That would be like looking directly at the sun. We can only see the real when it is reflected in the prism of the mind, which is why the Carrel windows are behind us when we work. The mind is meditating, but it is also mediating. It is, in the poet Yeats's phrase, moving on silence. And to work at its best, it needs a similarly mediating space, one which lets the thinker balance between the known and the yet to be known that will emerge from the scholarship the closet produces. Of course, this is a very old-fashioned model of scholarship, but I believe none the worse for its ancient and distinguished pedigree. Undeniably, as we plan the new library, we need to create other and very different spaces to meet other and very different needs, particularly the needs of undergraduates, for whom, obviously, Lauinger was intended only as a place of passage, borrow your books and go. But I hope that our innovations will also have the tact to leave Lauinger's many closets intact, its thoughtful quiet protected, its productive solitudes ensured. And in urging that protection, I want to end by contrasting our monstrosity, Lauinger, to another somewhat similar, but in fact oh so different monster, the Tower of Babel. Harbison describes the Tower of Babel, actually he's describing Bruegel's much reproduced painting of the Tower of Babel, as an endless complexity, an image of the earth in which parts can be so far from each other that they have no idea what each other or the whole body looks like. Babel, centrifugal, dispersive, alienating. Lauinger, centripetal, ingathering, harmonious. Its ordered strings of contiguous privacies, each closet only a doorway from the next, sourced by a stacked and common stem, germinating the production of individual thought that will become in turn the publication of ideas, and then, in the next turn, the circulation of discourse, until finally the life of the individual mind merges into the shared life of thought, which we call culture. Happy 40th birthday, Lauinger, our counter Babel, this thing of darkness. I happily and gratefully acknowledge mine. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was very thoughtful. It's a privilege for me to introduce Emmett Curran, but before I do, I'd like to thank several people who helped to make this history possible. I've already referenced Artemis Kirk and some of her colleagues, including Lynn Conway and Ann Galloway and Dave Hagan. But I'd also like to mention the following people who had a hand in the creation. Jack DeGioia, of course, who wrote the foreword, Jim O'Donnell, our provost, Tim Barbary, the dean of the graduate school, John Langan, the chair of the Georgetown University Press board, Eric Smolson, chief of staff in the president's office, many thanks, Eric, Jim Schaefer, associate dean in the graduate school and an outstanding photographer, and you can see his work this evening because his work is on the covers of the 3 volumes of Emmett Curran's history, in addition to having several illustrations within the volumes. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at Georgetown University Press, including Gina Lindquist, Maureen Mills, Jackie Bielhart from our marketing and sales department, as well as Julie Finnegan-Stoner, our publishing assistant. Publishing Emmett's history was a team effort in every sense of the word, but every team needs a driver, and the driver of our team was our editorial and production manager, Deb Weiner. Deb, who worked with our designer, Deborah Naylor, worked her typical magic to produce these gorgeous books and make sure they arrived, if not hot, then warm, off the press and in time for this event. Thank you, Deb. And now to Emmett. This book that he has written, this definitive history, 3 volumes, was a long and winding journey. Maybe not so much of a journey as an odyssey. And Emmett brought it home. Think of this room, Emmett, as your Ithaca. In my publishing career, I have worked with many authors and many personalities, some of them wonderful, some of them volatile. And I can say truthfully that I have never worked with an author who was more gracious or easier to work with than Emmett Curran. Publishers are people too. We like to publish books by nice authors. We're only human. Emmett was more than nice. He was a joy to work with from start to finish. A brilliant scholar, but more importantly, a genuinely decent individual. Emmett Curran is a native of Baltimore, earned an AB in history from the College of Holy Cross, an MA in history from Fordham, and a PhD in history from Yale. From 1972 to 2004, he was a member of the history department at Georgetown. He currently resides with his wife Eileen in Richmond, Kentucky. That would be south of Lexington. He's the author of Michael Augustine Corrigan and the Shaping of Conservative Catholicism, 1878 to 1902, and American Jesuit Spirituality, the Maryland Tradition. He's also the author of a forthcoming book, John Dooley's Civil War, Secession and Reconstruction, which will be coming from the University of Tennessee Press in 2012. And Emmett, for all that scholarship, it will be this 3-volume history, I think, that will be your signature. It was an honor to work with you. It's an honor to publish the history. And on behalf of my colleagues and everyone in this room and everyone within the Georgetown community, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Emmett Curran.
Thank you, Richard, and I'd certainly be remiss if I did not say something about the delight it's been to work with you in the press over the last several years in this final leg of the Odyssey. It's been terrific, and I can't thank you enough for the wonderful work that you and your staff have put into the making of these books, the exquisite design, the beautiful production. I saw the volumes for the first time this afternoon, and I just found them stunning pieces of work. So I hope you'll share the same and take the opportunity to look at these. I think it's so very fitting that our backdrop here today is the Joseph Durkin Collection in American Studies. Father Durkin, of course, was a fixture in this building from the day that it opened in 1970 right through the 1990s, where he, in one of those closets John was talking about up there on the 4th floor, pursued his prodigious scholarship and research over the years. Father Durkin really in many ways in the nearly 6 decades that he was on this campus came to personify in its academic, its moral, and its spiritual dimensions the very best that Georgetown aspired to be. So I think it's very appropriate that he stands behind us today in a way. I was asked to speak today about the ways in which Lauinger Library and its special collections made the writing of the 3 volumes of the Georgetown history possible. There is surely much to say about the role that Lauinger played in the shaping of my history of Georgetown, as I hope to show in a few minutes. However, I owe to Lauinger and to its people a lot more than I do simply for the contributions they made to the writing of a Georgetown history. I can really make a much broader statement that Georgetown Library and its special collections have made possible in very special ways whatever I have been able to produce as an historian since joining the faculty here nearly 40 years ago. And permit me to be a bit more particular by looking at the current state of my scholarship. Besides the Georgetown history, I hope, as Richard indicated just earlier, I hope to have two other books come out during the next several years. One is the edition of the Civil War writings of John Dooley that he referred to, Georgetown alumnus, captain in the 1st Virginia Regiment of the Army of Northern Virginia, who entered the Society of Jesus shortly after the end of the war. The other is a collection of essays that I've written over the past several decades dealing with various aspects of the Catholic communities in New York and in the Chesapeake region. Neither of these books, I can say with confidence, would have happened had I not had access to the unique materials that Lauinger houses, as well as having the extraordinary assistance of the talented people who work in Lauinger and its special collections. Let me just say a few words about how this affected my editing of the John Dooley papers. As I mentioned earlier, John Dooley became a Jesuit in the fall of 1865. He died here at Georgetown 8 years later. I visited his grave earlier today. The victim of the tuberculosis that he had contracted during his service in the Confederate Army, including 2 years in a federal prison off the shores of Sandusky, Ohio. Upon his death, Georgetown's president at the time, recognizing the historical worth of Dooley's writing about his war experience, ordered the college's then librarian, I confess I don't know who that is by name, to bind and preserve carefully for posterity's sake the war notes that Dooley had been diligently working on in the infirmary where he had spent the last years of his life. Well, what the librarian preserved was, first of all, less than half of Dooley's writings. And for those among Dooley's 9 original manuscripts that he did preserve, he made no effort whatsoever to impose any order or sequence on the material. So the manuscripts, as a result, are indiscriminately mixed together, pages hopelessly scrambled. Whether this bound volume was the entirety of the material that John Early, the president at the time, gave over to him, we'll simply never know. What we do know was what then Father Joseph Durkin came upon this material in the Georgetown Archives in the early 1940s when it was over in the basement of the Healy building, and discovered what he took at the time to be John Dooley's diary. He apparently did not have in hand anything close to the full body of Dooley's war notes. So subsequently, when in 1945 he published John Dooley, Confederate Soldier, his war journal, the journal was extremely spotty in many places. Weeks, months go by without anything happening to Dooley on the campaign trail or in prison. They're simply missing from the text. Well, not until Lauinger Library opened 40 years ago this year, were the archives of which Dooley's papers were part, formally organized by professional archivists, John Reynolds of dear memory being the first. It was most likely at that point, when they were organized, that they were finally, all these manuscripts were finally brought together. So more than 2 decades, when I initially examined the Dooley papers in the early 80s, all those 9 war manuscripts, they were in bad disarray, still scattered throughout, but they were all there together. More than 2 decades later, in June of 2009, I came back to re-examine the Dooley text, having decided that a new edition of the complete papers would be worth doing. Well, as I was scanning the various manuscripts, including what Dooley had labeled his war diary, and Father Durkin and all of us had assumed to be his Civil War diary, Lynn Conway, I think Lynn's here today, came out and said, "Have you ever seen this?" And it was a flyer from an auction house in Burlington, North Carolina, advertising an auction to take place in August of 1997. And on it said, being auctioned were various artifacts from the Dooley family, including an 100-page diary kept by John Dooley from August of 1862 to March of 1865. Now, as I had said, we always thought, like Father Durkin, that the war diary was the one that we have upstairs, was the one Dooley had kept during the war. Turns out that was not the case. Well, to make a long story short, following a suggestion from Lynn, I was able to contact the person in charge of historical collections at the Richmond estate of James Dooley, who had become a very successful entrepreneur in Richmond, who was the older brother of John. This person at the Richmond estate turned out had been the person who had sent the flyer to Georgetown to alert them that this auction was going to take place. She had gone down to Burlington the day of the auction, had bid on the diary, as had, I think, Nick Sheets here at Georgetown. Nick, is that true? You had phoned a bid into the auction house. Neither of them bid high enough. The auction was sold for $6,000 to a person to this day we still do not know who it is. I spent several months sending letters to prominent historians, Jim McPherson and others, to libraries and archival collections around the country, to Civil War trade artifact collectors, magazines, trade magazines of the Civil War period. Absolutely nothing. Nothing, it turned up absolutely nothing. Well, we do know, thanks again to the person at the Dooley estate, how the auction house came to have that diary. It turns out that John Dooley's youngest sister, who was here for his funeral, 1873, most likely took the diary away that day. Probably the Jesuit community gave it to her. Well, she ended up with the diary. And an irony here is Father Durkin interviewed this youngest sister back in the 1940s. Now, she was well in her 80s at the time. And she gave him letters that John Dooley had written from prison. She gave him a photograph of Dooley that's used in the 1945 edition. But she never told him about the diary. Now, maybe it just slipped her mind. I don't know. But she never mentioned it. Whatever the case, she eventually bequeathed the diary to a niece, who in turn passed it on to a daughter. And in the 1990s, the grand-grandniece, of this sister sold the diary, plus all kinds of other artifacts, including a Civil War uniform that the father had worn in the 1st Virginia, swords, all sorts of things, for a couple $100 to this auction house. They subsequently realized scores of thousands of dollars from the sale of these artifacts. Well, finally, after all of my efforts to find out who had the diary, I decided to go ahead with the edition, by this time convinced that virtually all of Dooley's original diary had survived in the various manuscripts that special collections still had. The ones that he had reworked in his years after the war and had elaborated upon. Well, special collections not only graciously gave permission for me, and I think it's mainly Nick that I have to thank for this, to photograph almost the entire corpus of the Dooley writings, but Ted Jackson, particularly of Special Collections, marvelously photographed the papers so that in the remote hills of Kentucky, I could transcribe and reconstruct them into the integrated set of memoirs that John Dooley had intended to leave for posterity. God willing, as Richard indicated, John Dooley's Civil War should be out over the next couple of years in time for the early celebration of the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. It simply could not have happened without Lauinger. For the second work, the collection of essays, I can be a lot briefer. All these pieces in that collection depend heavily for their sources upon correspondence and reports found in the Roman archives of the Society of Jesus. Now, this is a well-kept secret that in Special Collections' possession is a microfilm copy of the Society's Roman archives from the origins of the Society in the 16th century down to the end of the 19th century. I was thankfully able to take advantage of this treasure trove over the years, and I remember John Reynolds, again, generously allowing me the use of an old microfilm reader that I could put in my closet on the 4th floor to transcribe and translate those materials over the years. It is a very meditative and mediating space, and I miss it greatly. Again, without Lauinger, these essays would have gone unwritten. Well, finally, to Lauinger and the Georgetown history. When Tim Healy originally approached me about doing a history of the university, he said that I should have complete access to the university's archives. He wanted a candid history, honestly told. But of course, total access would have meant little had there been little to have access to. And nothing could have been further from the reality. Georgetown, I think, has been well blessed in many ways. Its location, its leadership, its faculty, to mention 3. But surely one of its more important blessings has been the rich array of records, written and visual, that document its past and are housed in the Special Collections Division of this place. Facilitating access to this storehouse of Georgetown's history has been the really extraordinary staff of Special Collections over the past 2 decades, from directors Marty Barringer and John Buchtel, to the University Archivist John Reynolds and Lynn Conway, to the head of manuscripts Nick Sheets, and to their assistants, including Lizette Matano, Scott Taylor, Ted Jackson, and Ann Galloway. Collectively, they made sure that the open door policy that Tim Healy had established really worked by astutely guiding myself and my research assistants, especially Anna Sam, Barbara Shuttleworth, and Sally Irvin, through the labyrinth within which Georgetown's deposited history resides. Just to give you some sense of the richness of the array of the university records that Special Collection houses, you should keep in mind student registers that date back virtually to the beginnings of Georgetown's academic history in the 1790s. Diaries through the centuries kept by Georgetown's presidents, administrators, faculty, students. Presidential correspondence, including letter books in the case of a few presidents, most notably that of Joseph Havens Richards, surely one of the most unsung presidents in Georgetown's history. Treasurer's account books, along with a substantial paper trail of financial activities, faculty, alumni files, persistently gathered with care over the 22 decades of the university's existence. Complete runs of student journals and newspapers, from the first, the College Journal in 1871, through the 2 major weeklies, or now bi-weeklies, the Hoya and the Voice, to the more transient periodicals such as the short-lived literary journal Three Sisters, and the total collection of the annual student records of university life through essays and photos that are the yearbooks of the 3 campuses. In addition to these is the wonderful resource of the archives of the Maryland province of the Society of Jesus, as well as the aforementioned microfilm of the Roman archives, all of which I made ample use. The particular collection of papers, too, of various faculty and alumni, administrative publications from the Discipline Office newsletter of the 1940s that have a remarkable a compendium of letters written by Georgetown alumni during the war to Father Richard Law about their war experience, to the midweek reports of the 1970s, to Georgetown Magazine of the 80s, and beyond to the blue and gray of more recent years. And last and hardly least, the papers, reports, and documentation of the various departments, offices, and operations that seem to expand so exponentially from the late 20th century on. But somehow, wonderfully so, the archives and special collections always managed to keep abreast in preserving this ever-escalating output of the rapidly developing bureaucracy. One of my goals in writing Georgetown's history was to create prosopographies, or demographic studies of faculty and students during the various eras that constitute Georgetown's nearly 2¼ centuries of existence. To do that meant building data banks, but that construction would have been simply impossible had Georgetown not possessed such a rich collection of faculty and student records. With them, we were able to develop a very expansive, extensive, computer-based student and faculty profile that provided an uncommon perspective on the multi-layered life of this university. Finally, I should say something about the extraordinary prominence of illustrations in the 3 books, and I hope you'll get an opportunity to appreciate this. The reviewers of the first volume cited the illustrations as, in 1993, as one of its most appealing features. John Reynolds was crucial in the amassings of photos for that volume. In fact, I think it should be said that no one was probably more responsible than John for building up the photographic collection that Special Collection houses into one of the most valuable resources that it has. Lynn Conway has inherited that mantle and done wonders in the refinement of the organization and in the development of the visual library that John brought into being. Thanks to her and to her staff, the photos in the 2nd and 3rd volumes of the history are a wonderful complement to the first. And here I should certainly make a special acknowledgement. His name has come up earlier. I need to repeat it, David Hagan, who has so artfully prepared all the images for the 3 volumes of this edition. When I first got the proofs back in Kentucky, I was really dumbstruck by the high definition, the vividness of the illustrations in the proofs of the 3 volumes, a level of quality far surpassing that of the 1993 edition. And to a large extent, I think that's the result of David's work, and what fine work it has been. So thank you, David. This then is what Lauinger and its special collections have meant to me over the past quarter century in pursuing my historiographical agenda. Without them, it's very fair to say that none of it would have happened, least of all this history of the institution at whose heart they lie. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Curran. I now have the pleasure to introduce you to our next speaker, the Provost of the University, James J. O'Donnell. He has been Provost since 2002. He's a distinguished scholar and an educational innovator. His scholarly work ranges widely in the cultural history of Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East in the later Roman and early medieval periods. Dr. O'Donnell previously was a member of the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania, but had the good sense to come to Georgetown, serving as Professor of Classical Studies, Vice Provost for Information Services and Computing, and Faculty Master of Hill College House. Prior to his positions at the University of Pennsylvania, he taught at Bryn Mawr College, the Catholic University of America, and Cornell University. He earned a bachelor's degree Phi Beta Kappa and was elected Latin salutatorian at Princeton University in 1972. He earned his doctorate in classics from Yale in 1975. He is going to talk to us today about the library of the 21st century. Jim.
Thank you, and good evening. It is an immense privilege and pleasure to be here to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Lauinger Library. The year 2070 in which we live is an exciting time, as you well realize. President Zahara Marley Pitt-Jolie, she of the distinguished parents, is facing midterm elections next year. You will recall that she was the first non-US born President of the United States. This after the emergency constitutional amendment passed when the last sane and rational natural-born citizen of the United States went berserk from watching too much reality television. Here at Georgetown, rumor is running rampant this week about the possibility that President John J. DeGioia may soon be announcing his retirement after only 70 years in office. President DeGioia is expected to scotch those rumors next week when he returns from Rome, where he has been attending the canonization ceremonies for a beloved former provost. As we look back at the history of Georgetown and Lauinger Library, it's hard to recall the early age of this building, back in a time when information scarcity ruled. It seems impossible now to imagine and realize that when this building was built, they didn't need all of it, even for books. There were whole floors that were taken up by academic departments and by other offices of the institution. There was great foresight, to be sure, in 1970 in imagining that eventually the building would be filled. But rapidly over the decades that followed, the outflow of information and publication filled the shelves and corridors and hallways and garrets and attics of this space to such a point that they soon even began keeping analog materials at remote locations around the Washington, D.C. area. It was calculated in about the year 2005 that the majority of the material collected in the building by that year 2005 had been published after the building itself had been opened. So much for the heritage of Western civilization, so much for the way we transform and renew that. Well, of course, in those days, information was a scarce thing. People needed to hunt and gather for it. The skills we taught in graduate school were hunter-gatherer skills to bring together precious treasures, amass them one scrap of information at a time. What you see on the PowerPoint screen here behind me is a picture of furniture which can only be described as truly hideous and dysfunctional. Those are called filing cabinets, class. They were large metal clunky boxes in which one piece of paper after another was carefully stored. And there were people whose whole lives were devoted to the task of serving as, so help me, file clerks, putting pieces of paper in those drawers and then taking them out again afterwards, rather like Eeyore with his birthday present back in the classic literature of Winnie the Pooh. Sometimes in libraries, the cabinets were kept in a more compressed and downsized version, the contents of them being tiny 3-by-5-inch cards, many of them written on by hand, in which the riches of the library were collected and cataloged on a few mere tens of thousands of scraps of paper. They even published, back in those days, things like this. They took those little cards out of the files, file clerks were very busy doing so, took pictures of all of them, and published them in book form. You can even scarcely imagine that once upon a time, in a room much like this, whole walls would be filled with shelves bearing nothing but volume after volume like this. Sorry, I need to step out of the frame for a moment. Is John Bushman here? Where's John? He must be here somewhere. John, we have to talk later. The way this shtick is supposed to go is those curtains aren't supposed to be there and hundreds of green volumes are supposed to be on the shelves, as they were until very recently. Back in frame. It's hard to imagine what it was like when this kind of object felt like a miracle of high-speed, globe-spanning information access, telling you exactly where that book you were looking for was in some library in Kentucky or Tennessee or Vermont or Austria. We've gotten over learning what it's like to live in a world in which information is not scarce, but abundant. We've gotten over that busy jargon that was practiced back in the early days of Lauinger when people thought they lived in the information age. Just as before that, people thought they lived in the space age or the aviation age or the railroad age. We still have trains and planes and rocket ships and information. But we now realize that each of these revolutions does not create something new. It creates instead a power that has been implicit in human beings and in our culture for all the time of human history. Living in a world in which we have a superabundance of information brings out the fullness of our intellectual and cultural powers as human beings, finding and using exactly the information we need to make rational decisions about our culture, our lives, and our society. We today, in 2070, we are blasé about an abundance of information. We expect it to be ubiquitously available to us wherever we happen to be, transparent to users all across the globe, all the pieces of it interoperating with each other so that you don't need to know about one database or another, but very simple searching tools take you to the information you want. Or, well, almost. In fact, it turns out that having a lot of information is still a challenge for all of us. I can do no better in describing what has become of the world in which we live than go back to some words that were written by that wise and beloved former provost way back in the last century, back when they thought they lived in an information age, and when he talked about what would become of librarians in the future. We have grown up, he said, assuming that information is a scarce resource and devised our economies accordingly. But in an information waterfall, the virtual library that tells us everything and sweeps us off our feet with a cataract of data will not be highly prized. The librarian will be more an active participant in staving off info chaos. If the traditional librarian has been conceived as a figure at home in the discreet silences and cautious dealings of a Henry James novel, now perhaps the right model will be found in James Fenimore Cooper or the Star Wars films, something between the Pathfinder Natty Bumppo and the Jedi Knight. Oh, how true those words now resonate for us as we here in Lauinger Library value our librarians for their skills in helping us through the massive information that we take for granted, to find the cherished items, the particular units that mean most to us at the time at which they mean most for us. They are the people to whom we send our students the first week they arrive here, and they quickly bond in a partnership with our students as they have long bonded in partnership with our faculty, to be the pathfinders, the guides, the spiritual gurus for the search for and the use of information in this world in which we live. We love our librarians. We love as well our library. Ever since what used to be Healy Hall across the way collapsed unexpectedly one time in the 2030s and was replaced by that glorious, you can just see it out the windows, that neo-brutalist pile glowing and glowering gray next to Lauinger Library. Finally, we see the full aesthetic beauty and glory. Work with me here, people, please. I'm trying. The full aesthetic beauty and glory of this space. But we know that this is the place we come when we look for help. It's a collaboration space for us. It's a collaboration space for our students. And the coffee is absolutely outstanding and has been for many, many decades. The librarians we find here have two vital functions for us, besides holding our hands in moments of desperation. They're very simple functions. They throw stuff away and they keep stuff. Once upon a time, their task was more to find and keep stuff. But as we found ourselves in a world of too much stuff, then discreetly, carefully, thoughtfully, throwing stuff away, both physically but more often virtually, is an important task. Helping us know what of all the information that now surrounds us in the world we don't need, can't want, and shouldn't use is an absolutely vital service for which we have come to depend upon them. They help us select and filter and find and customize the information by which we are surrounded for our purposes, and we are immensely grateful to them for this. At the same time, they help us keep stuff. They help us keep the traditional materials. They help us keep the digital materials. Loud arguments break out among librarians at their conferences over who has just the harder job, preserving and protecting the analog print materials, many of which in this building now are 100 and hundreds of years old and need to be cared for with special tools and techniques, or preserving, with great difficulty as well, the digital information of the last decades and the last century, all of which seems to be on some disk form of storage or another that you can't quite find, or that maybe just crashed last week. Finding the works of our scholars from the first half of the 21st century is paradoxically harder sometimes than finding the works of the scholars of the 20th century. Because to find the works of those scholars of the 21st century, you need to know that the electricity has stayed running, the media have stayed sound, and that care for those pieces of information has persisted. It used to be the case that we would find stories of ancient manuscripts. There's one story from 1712 of an ancient manuscript turning up that had been sitting on top of an armoire in a library for probably centuries, unheeded and unknown, and still, because it was on non-acid-based animal skins, easily readable by the first person who came upon it. We found, in trying to spruce up Lauinger Library last week for these ceremonies, some old things on top of a cabinet here in the library. We had to go to the so-called World Wide Web to find pictures of what they were. We discovered they were called floppy disks. We haven't yet quite figured out what they were used for, but it's quite clear that the storage and preservation of information was not one of their functions. The librarians who keep the stuff also help us find it. They provide intellectual access, and that's been a tool of librarianship for many centuries, a newly challenging tool and task for them in our time. And of course, they preserve that which is unique and special. The documents in our special collections, as we call them, which now fill most of this building, are the precious, unique heritage items of Georgetown University, of Washington, D.C., of the Society of Jesus, and other sources from which we have derived them, cherishing and protecting those in perpetuity, and helping unique users, such as the distinguished historian Emmett Curran, who just published the 5th volume of his History of Georgetown University last week. Helping them find and use those sources is a task which we have entrusted to them and which they carry out with great distinction. It is indeed a beautiful thought to think that Lauinger is now 100 years old, to think that it will flourish for many centuries more. We've put a few dollars into it in at least recent years over that time, and that it will continue to stand for what it stands for. I think it's very appropriate that here at the 100th anniversary ceremonies, we have installed the beautiful new searchlight up in the tower on the top of the building. Okay, it's a carbon neutral searchlight, but it's a searchlight. And when later this evening, as dusk falls, we switch it on for the first time and it shoots its beams across our campus, then you will truly see embodied in a physical way what we have known for many decades here in Lauinger Library, that this building truly in every possible sense deserves to be spoken of both literally and figuratively as a beacon of learning. Thank you for joining us this evening.
The phrase beacon of learning is very meaningful to all of us, but we'll spare you the explanation at this moment. I want to ask you to join me in thanking again these 3 absolutely wonderful speakers for some terrific presentations this evening. And they have offered to come to the podium and take your questions, for which we have a little bit of time. So, John, Emmett, Jim, if you would come. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, please feel free to use the microphone, which Russell is kindly adapting for us. And we welcome your questions, comments, and ideas of our speakers.
Oh.
Emmett, Tony Curbs.
Tony, have you sung from a microphone in that posture before? You look
Actually, Jim,
looking good.
does this look familiar? As you went through this process, what was the most interesting new thing that you found out that really surprised you and intrigued you about Georgetown and its history?
That's a good, excellent question. Looking back over the whole experience of doing the 3 volumes, I would say the realization of how truly international and national and diverse Georgetown was virtually from its beginnings. I think that really surprised me. And I say diversity in terms of where students and indeed faculty were coming from, racial diversity, the religious diversity of the institution virtually from its founding. That was a quality I really wasn't prepared to find in particularly the first century of the institution's history. So I would say that was the most surprising.
My name's John Skudlark, School of Foreign Service, class of '83. And I actually wanted to say that I sort of wanted to reinforce a couple of those points. I actually never did have a carrel, but occasionally I would use one when back in the old days when we had to type our papers and you could get one. And it really was great. But, you know, I love this library. And I didn't even appreciate when I came here in 1979 how new it was. I really enjoyed the thought about some of that great intellectual learning, Jack, that happened right here in this room, and I'm guilty as charged. We used to really like to go to the reading room in the back, too, and overlook the river and goof off, and I guess now you can do that and drink coffee, which is really excellent. But I also want to say that I had English class downstairs on the first floor, first semester freshman year, and as it turns out, that's actually where I met the first love of my life, and it was right here at Georgetown, right here in Lauinger Library. So I want to say that it is a very definite center point of this university community, and I thank you all for your wonderful reflections, and Dr. Curran for writing the history of Georgetown and including the wonderful acknowledgement of the staff here at the library. So thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I would like to add, if I might, I think two persons in particular who should be acknowledged with an occasion that celebrates the 40th anniversary are Joe Jeffs, who really began the planning for this library back when Father Bunn was still the president of the institution, and then Father Jerry Campbell, who is still on this campus at the Jesuit community, under whose presidency he made it the top priority for the institution over the next decade. And as a result, you had the unprecedented achievement of this institution opening within a course of 2 years, not one, but 3 major libraries on its 3 campuses. This building in Lauinger, the Dahlgren Memorial Library on the medical campus, and the Edward Bennett Williams Library at the Law Center, the original one there. They all opened between 1970 and 1972. Extraordinary.
I'm Pierce Corden, the class of '63 at college. John, hello.
Pierce, nice to see you again. It's been a long time.
Yeah, I've known several of the provosts over the years, including Al Kelly and others, some of whom were distinguished Jesuits, and I suspect all of the provosts were distinguished. So I was just wondering, which one in particular is being canonized in Rome?
It's hard to say. There's so many of them worthy of that honor.
I would like to make a case for one provost. Unfortunately, he's no longer living. That's Father Fitzgerald. He was my boss. And he's the one who provided the funding for building the collection. We had a miserable budget before we moved over here. And he had the long-range, he foresaw what Georgetown could be in the way of a educational institution, and recognized that you needed to have materials in the library. And I remember going up with him when they disbanded one of the Jesuit seminaries up in Pennsylvania, and they had a wonderful classics library. And I spent a couple of days up there going through and I had first choice among the various Jesuit libraries in the province. And that formed the basis of, Jim will be happy, of our classics collection. We had nothing really before that. So Father Fitzgerald was my unsung hero, and I only wish he were here today so that we could tell him personally what a great part he played in the development of what is the most important part of the library, its collections.
I'm John Eswine from the class of 42, and I just thought I would have to say something about that this library wasn't here. As a matter of fact, students did not use the library. It was over in a Healy building, I guess. And of course, it was a beautiful building, a beautiful space, which in the process between then and now has gone downhill and come back. I mean, that was a mess in the 60s. I can say that. I did some artwork over there. So I just thought I'd have to say something.
Thanks, John.
I just saw recently someone had done a poll of the 10 most beautiful libraries in the world, and Riggs, the one that Dr. Eswine was referring to, was voted one of the 10 most beautiful, thanks to Tim Healy, who so wonderfully restored that space.
Well, we have more for you to enjoy and appreciate. We have a book signing to follow. We have a wonderful reception. I would like to suggest that there is an 11th most beautiful library, and I think it's the Lauinger Library of today. I love this building, just as so many of you do. I want to thank all of you for joining us for this wonderful celebration, this co-celebration of the Lauinger Library's 40th anniversary and the publication of Emmett Curran's book. Thank you to the Georgetown Press. Thank you, President DeGioia, for serving as our host for the press, and of course to our speakers, John Glavin, Emmett Curran, and Jim O'Donnell. And another thank you to the library associates. If you aren't a member and you'd like to become a member, we'd love to have you join us. You may talk to me or to Jessica Pierce or Tess Winkler during the reception. It's a wonderful way to engage with the community, and this really today has kind of the spirit of a Georgetown mega family reunion, so do more of the same. Join the library associates. Off to our book signing and reception. We very much enjoyed having you all here, and I thank you very, very much. Happy anniversary, Lauinger. Thank you.